So, we talked about CIP 002 earlier, and, we need to, basically address the other 7 requirements. So I'm going to start with, and what these requirements actually mean. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Feel free to ask questions and chime in wherever you feel fit, wherever you see fit or whatever. So I'll start with CIP 003.R1. It's kind of funny, I won't, tell you where this happened at, but I used to believe that all I had to do for this requirement is say that we're following CIP 2 through 9, and the auditors let me know that, that's not, well, not the auditors, but a guy that used to be an auditor that kind of started the whole WEC thing, let us know that you have to actually regurgitate the NERC CIP requirements, and you have to cross-reference your policies with their policies. So you've got to build this big matrix of all the policies on your side and their side, and you've got to regurgitate basically everything that's in the NERC CIP standards, or you will not be compliant. And I speak from experience. It's true. So basically, the basic premise of this is if you go through the CIP 2 process we talked about before, and you have an asset that's not considered a critical asset and doesn't have critical cyber assets, then you don't have to actually meet this policy. It only applies to critical cyber assets. Then we go on to leadership, and we were talking about this earlier. Basically, CIP 3R2 requires you to designate a senior manager as the person responsible for NERC CIP, and this is the person that's technically accountable for it. That person can also make delegations. Usually they delegate it to the asset owner. The asset owner then establishes designees to carry out the process, and then finally it gets down to the security representative. This is just typical. And then the security representative would basically carry out the mission, the standards.
Can you please give me an example of what would be typical items of the person
So
the senior manager slot?
So the senior manager ends up being, usually it's the CEO or the GM or somebody like that level. And then they always, they're not going to deal with it, so they'll delegate it to the asset owner. Sometimes it'll go directly to the system operations manager, but what happens, that next designation ends up being the asset owner, which is like, so if I had a plant, maybe the plant manager that next designation goes to, and then they establish designations because they don't know how to really carry it out, right? So they find a bunch of guys that, they're not even security guys half the time. They're just these operations guys that don't know anything about security, not knocking them or anything like that. It's just kind of the way it is, and they'll designate the responsibility to them for specific requirements, and then they go out and find a security guy. What happens is, in my opinion, what happens is that, the security guys actually know what to do to make all this stuff happen, but they have no visibility to the senior manager, and these designees don't want to, budget for, meeting the compliance standards or, just doing security in general. So I think a lot of times this is why NERC ends up falling by the wayside, or it ends up being just a compliance effort. I think if you elevated the security position to that higher level, then you would have the investment. It wouldn't just be a compliance effort at that point. It would end up being, people using the compliance effort to establish a security framework or security infrastructure and doing what really needs to be done to secure and this, again, I'm not knocking anybody. I'm not saying that. I've never worked for a place that did this wrong, I'm just saying that, I think that's kind of the issue. And if you go look at the way FSMA is kind of structured, they kind of have it structured where they delegate responsibility to the CIO, and then they have to have a senior agency information security officer right below that person to, basically carry out the cybersecurity mission. So I think NERC needs something similar to that, or they need to figure out a way to get that security position elevated, or at least, or even make the senior manager have security qualifications.
Since it's federal, right? Federal guidance for federal people.
Yep.
They can say you will have a CIO.
That's right.
But you can't do that here exactly.
Yeah, exactly. 'Cause, I mean, every organization is different. I mean, I've been in some organizations where, you can't use the title of officer because that just means something, and you're not allowed to go there basically. Some organizations, I worked in the government, and officer, we had lots of cybersecurity officers, so it just depends. Then, CIP 3R3 is the exceptions process. You know, basically, I see this as kind of like a sort of like risk management, because you're finding non-compliance issues, gaps, and when you find those gaps, you want to track those gaps, and you've got to, you know, basically come up with a strategy to remediate it. Again, the auditors will make sure that you have a plan for fixing the issue, and if you can't fix the issue, you know, you've got to have the full evidence trail from. You know, I'll give you an example. If you know, you have some system where the password has to be the same no matter what, you can't change it because all these other embedded systems rely on that password. You have to pretty much go back and get a note from the vendor to prove to the auditor that, you know, you're not just blowing smoke, basically. You know, that, you know, really, if you change the password, it will affect reliability, and the vendor recommends that you don't change the password, and you basically have to prove that. Josh, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but that's been my experience. I kind of view it as a risk management framework. I use the exception process, or I'm going to say I've used the exception process, but I view the exception process as a way to basically track gaps and establish risk associated with those gaps. I think this is your opportunity to develop a risk register and talk about why, you know, if you've got certain gaps, talk about what the impacts of those gaps are, talk about what the risks of those gaps are, and use it to kind of further your cybersecurity program. But I don't even think you guys really even audited that too much.
I think probably the biggest information to add on to exception processes is that with respect to auditing the standard, what we're looking for, or what I was looking for in auditing the exception process, were exceptions to where you're different from the NERC standard. So if you created a cybersecurity policy that exceeds the NERC standard, then if you cannot meet that somewhere, you have an exception to this process at a minimum. Right? You wouldn't write an exception for a non-compliance issue. So if you were in violation of not giving someone training, right, that's not an exception because you're not approving it. Right? You're not saying it's okay that we did that. That's a violation. That's a difference. So the exception process itself is for when you are approving something that goes beyond the NERC CIP standards or is specific to your organization that you've included within your cybersecurity policy. That's a very important distinction to make. But as Mike states, it's a very good model for developing a risk register within your organization. But from an auditing, bare minimum, bare bones requirement, looking at it that way, kind of just what I was alluding to.
You, in other words, get in trouble if you develop the risk register.
But
So you don't want to make that evidence, basically.
Let me just ask you, let me understand this. So if I create a policy that exceeds NERC standards, and I'm not following that policy, for some crazy reason, I created a policy and I'm not following it, and you audit me, you're gonna ding me on my policy that exceeds NERC standards?
So part of the almost sort of into every requirement in NERC CIP, it says, you know, I won't say almost every requirement, that's probably the right way to characterize that. It says document and implement something, right? And part of that is that cybersecurity policy. Document, maintain, and implement that program. So if you write a cybersecurity policy that exceeds NERC CIP standards, in those instances where you're exceeding, if the implementation is measured by the audit team and they found that you did not implement it as described, then that could be a scenario for violation. Unless you wrote it in as an exception and you approved it, or, you know, we're not going to require, I'm trying to think of a good one that's not a NERC CIP requirement, but maybe you have a PLC out in a generation plan that you're not going to put a locking screensaver on. It's not possible. But your cybersecurity policy says for all company assets, you're going to have a locking screensaver, password locking. Well, that's not a NERC CIP requirement, right? So you exceeded it. So you now write an exception for those PLCs in the generation plan. You document that, approve that. You've now implemented your cybersecurity policy as written and have an approved exception.
So I'm creating more work for myself.
Pretty much.
And I think that's
And you know, one of the common things that I've, you know, just witnessed in industry, again, not at my company, but they don't want policies that they can't conform to already. So that's where I think, you know, maybe we need to go back and probably have that discussion, because I think it's actually a good thing if you have gaps. If you find your gaps and you're evaluating the gaps, we should encourage that, in my opinion, because that's just good risk management. But the way most people see it is if you have a gap, and you know, if I'm not 100% compliant, then I got a problem. If I'm, you know, and they see 100% compliance as 100% secure, so, you know, that's kind of a competing issue, I think, in my opinion. Then you go into the information protection requirements, and this is kind of one that a lot of people don't really understand, and it took me a while to kind of get my arms around it. You know, obviously the whole standard's not up there, but basically in CIP 3R4, they've got a list of criteria that tell you, you know, basically what kind of information is deemed to be critical. And each of these bullet points is, you know, think of it as referenced with, you know, except for list is required in standard 002, you know, it has to be a critical cyber asset associated with one of those components. So if you have an operational procedure for a critical cyber asset, that will be considered critical cyber asset information. Same thing with your CIP 2 list, your critical asset list and your critical cyber asset list. That's all considered critical cyber asset information. You can, you know, kind of see the rest of the stuff. But the basic approach is that you need to know what is critical. So let's say you take an environment, again, let's say some substation, and what you really want to do is you want to go in and you want to find out, you know, do they have any information that matches this criteria? And if they do, you want to know where it is and who has access to it. And that seems like a long, this is kind of the approach that, you know, managing information as an asset type approach, and I think they use that term in the IT world. But this will help you basically identify what you have that's critical, where it's at, and who has it. And that's going to be important as you move into the next, as you move into CIP 3R5, which is the access control requirement behind that. Somebody's got to review and approve these lists on an annual basis. And they're going to want to see that as evidence that you've got a, you know, basically an approver that's approved this list of people. It doesn't say that you have to restrict access. It just says that you have to know who has access, and that access needs to be reviewed and approved on an annual basis.
You have a critical asset that has no critical cyber access. You're required to protect equipment layouts of that facility.
If you don't have any critical cyber assets, then the CIP 3.R1 policy doesn't apply, because it's all about critical cyber assets. The asset's still critical, but there's nothing in there that could be, I guess, attacked maliciously. I'd say that within the scope of NERC CIP, I mean, obviously, you know, things can still go wrong. So, any other questions? So I'll move on to change control and configuration management. Oh, sorry.
This is a question for both you and probably Josh, because he's a former regional entity guy. A lot of information is being collected about violations and so forth like that, where you're not in compliance. And the standards don't speak directly to that information, but that's sensitive information in my mind that should be protected too. And CIP 2 also addresses NERC and regional entities that happen to be in compliance. So there are people that come down, had to have met all the background checks when they're doing the audits and all that kind of stuff. I'm assuming that's what that means. Mm-hmm. And because they don't have any critical assets at an RE facility or a NERC facility. What are the information protections per CIP standards that should be applied to information about audits that would reveal insight into the status of critical assets, but not necessarily maybe meet the criteria what he had up on the board? You see what I'm getting at?
Well, the way that I look at that is that, you know, we're authorizing WEC to, or, you know, CERC or whoever, to have access to that information.
Yeah, while they're on site. But then when they go
Even off-site, because we're uploading it to them, we're encrypting it, we're giving them the password. You know, we do take, I mean, we don't, but, you know, utility companies take the right, you know, measures to provide that information to the auditors. But
I think the short answer is the same protective measures that are required for an entity to adhere to is the same protective measures that the regional auditor should protect their information by, at the very minimum. That's not forced by the NERC rules of procedure. That's not required. Basically, what's stated in there. And Steve, maybe you can back me up on this too. You know, what's in there is basically we will protect your information pursuant to the risk. That's essentially the statement that's there. It doesn't give any specific requirements. At some of the regional entities, very specific solutions were implemented. At WEC, we were using open source encryption, as Mike talked about. You know, Mike's was one of the WEC registered entities, or is. So that method was applied to him, but also reliability first Southwest Power Pool, RE. They're using strong encryption methods to receive data and protect that information. But I don't think it's enough yet at the regional entities. They need more funding to do that. But I think that should be, at the very minimum, they should be required to do what everyone in this room is required to do. So.
The standards themselves don't specifically address those essential elements of information that can be protected come out of an audit related back to this. And the other concern is you take all this common vulnerability information, it goes into databases, and the regional entities are rolling these databases up into a single system, I think it is somewhere. That really concerns me because if I'm an attacker, I go find that regional entity database, and who knows what security's on that one. I've had non-security people at regional entities explain how it works, and they haven't a clue what they're doing, and I'm really, that's the place I'm going to attack and get the information.
Yeah, I think one thing that would cover it as registered entity information is transmitted to the regional entities. The information protection program established by that registered entity really does apply to that information as it's in transit. So really the regional entities should, again, at a minimum be adhering to that information protection program, but it makes sense to just have an overarching strong NERC adopted and mandated for all the regional entities, and NERC information protection program that really specifies what they need to do.
I don't think there is a program.
No, there isn't.
Yeah, well, I think we might end up waiting until one of these entities gets hacked and loses the data, like the social security numbers, and then, we'll complain about it. But
Okay, all I can really speak to, I mean, I work at NERC now, but I used to be at SPPRE, and I know the way that we did it was a little different than what Josh is describing. We had a standard that applied across the board, that we didn't so much look at each person's or each registered entity's standards and say, hey, let's match that. First thing I'd like to say, and I think this is across the board with all regional entities, I believe that, I know that we did, I believe that the only information that's stored long-term is the actual PVs themselves, or when they turn into a violation, it gets stored. And there is some possibly useful information as far as reconnaissance kind of, there's not going to be firewall rules, there's not going to be architecture drawings. Any information is potentially useful, but as far as, that there could be I got to throw a disclaimer in there, because with the TFE process, TFE, it requires, and I don't know if everybody's familiar with technical feasibility exceptions, if you've heard of that. In evaluating them, some regions actually are getting their hands on, the keys to the kingdom, I guess you could say, the actual firewall rules and things that you really, it makes people nervous. An ISO in a company hates to see that stuff leave your company in any way. But I know that at SPP, our jobs were on the line. We got audited by third parties. We got audited by NERC and by FERC every year. And they went down to the level of searching through our emails. They said, give us all your email for the past year. We couldn't delete emails. And they would look through emails. They would run programs scanning for sensitive information, and people would be fired. We never had an incident. We had a zero, I was only there a year and a half, but we had a zero finding year and a half while I was there. During an audit, and immediately following an audit, while the determination is being made before a settlement and all this or anything takes place like that, while it's still in compliance and not yet in enforcement, there's your kind of chink in the armor, so to speak, because right then you are going to basically have information, any supporting information that the regional entity can feed to their lawyer. Their legal staff may be in a court battle or something, so they have to have the information. Again, I hear your concerns, and I think it's your concerns are shared among everybody in the industry. But I do, as far as it's not something where it's taken lightly. I know for sure at SPPRE there's jobs on the line. It's the kind of thing where people don't frivolously hang on to information. It's always on encrypted drives. And this is something that the director, our director at the time, Kevin Perry, I don't know if you heard of him, but he's kind of well known in the industry. He would actually just randomly say, today I'm going to look at everybody's laptops, bring them into my office, look and see that, make sure everybody's stuff was in an encrypted partition. So we weren't doing whole disk encryption because there were some issues with that, but as far as any sensitive information was kept encrypted on the laptops. This definitely doesn't, we need more time than my 2 minutes in the spotlight to cover this topic, but But just know and make your voice heard. If it's, I could foresee someday this actually being in a future version of CIP. If it's not, then maybe there's going to be a whole separate set of standards that the regions have and NERC and FERC has to be held to, because there's copies of this stuff not just at the regions.
That'd be an interesting thing to see actually how that information is handled all the way through the chain of custody. But
If I may ask one more question
Sure.
about information protection. Since the standard applies to CCAs, what if you're replacing your EMS system and it is not yet declared a CCA, and you're working with your vendor, and obviously there are network drawings and floor plans and that sort of thing? Discuss that a little bit, but distinguish between best practice and what's actually
yeah,
required.
I think the official rule is that if it's not a critical asset, then the information is not technically a critical cyber asset. Or if there are no critical cyber asset, then the information is technically not critical cyber asset information. Now, if you're leaking out, diagrams and stuff like that of your control center, you're probably going to have a security issue. So I think from a best practice,
I mean, those documents are going to become part of your
Yeah.
CCA, and once you go live with it.
I'll let Jim answer it.
We've had this discussion at the standards team about what the intent was, what's documented, et cetera. Let's say you're building a new substation, or a new control center, or whatever it's going to be, and when you turn that place on operationally, it's going to be a CA or a CCA or whatever it's going to be, and all the documentation associated at that point in time going forward, of course, is going to have to be. But it's up to you to protect that information going into it, that you know it's going to be, because if you don't control it ahead of time and you lose control of the information, then it's out there, you don't have any control of the information. So ahead of time now, if you're building anything, new assets, whether they're going to be CAs or CCAs when you're doing it, or should. And that should be a question every time you add a new server. Is this going to be a CA or CCA type server? If it is, then you need to protect that information going in through the development and build.
Yeah, I think, if you go back to the NERC CIP implementation.
My opinion.
I think it says something allude to what you just said. Now that I think about it, I don't know if it's category 1 or I don't understand all that stuff that they got in there, but I know there's some category in there that once the asset becomes critical, basically you never had a program before. Now the asset's becoming critical, but that day it becomes critical. You got to be in compliance with all the CIP standards. So that, so when you're doing that, if you're under that implementation schedule, you're about to commission a new facility, you'd be putting that program and all that process in place before you go live, basically. So the answer would be, technically they would have it, or they would have to have it before they go live. So I think does that answer your question? So on the change control and configuration management, and this is actually, I think, a dispute or debate in industry right now is, should all changes be tracked, or is it only the significant changes that are illustrated in CIP 7, R1, and R3? My opinion is that, again, I don't represent the opinion of my company, but my opinion is that all changes should be tracked. You should do a change control for every change to the control system because of the potential impact. All changes should be approved so that management is aware of what you're doing. And then you really need a before and after configuration so I can go back and do a forensic investigation on whether or not you really changed what you said you were going to change. And there's tools out there to do this. I mean, I've seen, in control system environments, people use tripwire and Encircle and things like that to track the configurations. It's basically there so I can go back and look and see, if somebody did do something malicious. One of the other things that I would, this is kind of touching on the AMI space, but then really, best practices in general is I would look at developing security configuration checklists, just because when you get into the later standards, we get into CIP 7, you'll see they'll start wanting you to test it to make sure that the security controls remain in place. So what I do a lot of times, I'll go on 853 and pull out the kind of what I consider the technical security requirements, and basically look at configuration on a smart meter. How does it restrict access? How does it do auditing? How does it do communication protection? That kind of thing. And so you just know what that security configuration is, and then later on, it's good for configuration management, but really later on, when you get into the CIP 7 standards, they start talking about how do you make sure that you made a change that didn't change the security control, and this is really one of the only ways to be able to actually measure something like that, is to come up with a checklist like this. Moving on to CIP 4, the CIP 4R1, basically you're required to have an awareness program. These are like posters and quarterly emails, and just basically it's just a good security practice in any case to let everybody know, you know, what is CIP, what is cybersecurity, and you know what they should do about it. One of the other things, and maybe Josh or Steve, you can help put some clarification on this, is I think it talks about specialized training in the standard, but it's not clear on whether or not you have to actually have specialized training. What that means is, if you're going to be on the incident response team, shouldn't you be trained to be on the incident response team? Shouldn't you be trained to know what to do? I'm not clear that the standard actually forces you to do that, but it seems like it's implied. But what I've seen in practice is that they don't care. So I don't know if you, I don't know what the microphone is.
Yeah, I know definitely when I know definitely when I was out auditing, we were looking for role-specific training. So it's nice to have the nice general training that applies to everyone, but we would expect that there was some difference in the level of training for a janitor that, you know, goes and cleans the control room floor and the EMS support personnel. We'd expect there was additional training for them, for the EMS support personnel, not the janitor. Sorry. So that was our expectation. We definitely audited that way.
So just something to keep in mind.
We've been doing CIP standards since 2008, and one of the things we have in our training program is, for example, like our contracts people. You say, why do the contract people need to know about CIP? Well, we have a lot of things having to do with vendor arrangements, having to involve access control, personal reliability assessments, and so forth. So you train the contract folks on the things they need to know to do their job dealing with vendors that have to be, and staff that have to be in compliance. And you could do the same thing with legal, do the same thing with HR, because everybody's got a bite of the apple if you take a look at all the different functions. And you really got to sit down and think about what the functions are. And the first year you're doing this, it'll quickly pop out what those functions are, and then you need to go back and tailor that and clean it up and make it work pretty. But a lot of this training has to be tailored. There's no way you can just have one 20-slide pack that says, here's the standards, and read the standards to somebody. Mm-hmm. Technically, I guess you've done it, but if if I was an auditor, I'd be really questionable. So what do you train the contract people on, for example, as opposed to the guy that swept the floor? Each of them need to know different things.
Mm-hmm. And I would even take it probably even a little step further than that. What I would think best practice would also include is the system administrators would need specialized training, especially and the domain administrators and even the people that manage the exchange system, because there's a lot of critical cyber asset information, I'm sure, traversing the exchange server, and if you've got access to it, you can probably see whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, typically, and if you look at NIST and those who have done that, I mean, they usually distinguish between general awareness training, particularly for typical users, maybe not janitors, but people that certainly have desktops, and those who, specialized security training is where their emphasis is. Now, like everyone's saying, there's different gradations, and of course, it's anybody's guess, what is going to be acceptable in the future. But clearly, where you've got a system administrator, a SCADA administrator, or you've got somebody, this information security officer, whoever that is designated, there's going to be some interest in, sending them to some sort of training that's specialized for that. I think beyond that, it really comes down to not just, are you teaching the contractors, procurement, or other people different things, but, what's the mode of doing it? Are you doing formalized hands-on training in the case of people with significant security responsibilities, or is it going to be PowerPoints like this where they basically attend a briefing once a year, and you may have, okay, here's our 10-slide deck for procurement, here's our 10-slide deck for janitors, here's our, and so forth. And I guess that's, it becomes the issue of where do you consider to be specialized and what it is, because there are time limitations and cost issues involved, and I don't know that there are good guidance on what procurement people should have, other than handing them the stuff that DHS, that you and other people have written, and breaking that down into those, because I mean, sometimes you're lacking good material.
To take the absurd level of what auditors are looking at for compliance on this, I had them come back and wanted to see the rosters of actually who attended each of those training sessions. And of course, we had the lesson plans and the slides that were used, so we could say, here's what we trained. And then the next question was, well, how do you know they retained that information? What test or what measurement did you have to demonstrate that they actually retained or learned the information being presented? And I said, show me where it says I'm supposed to have a test. And they backed off. But that's the kind of scrutiny you're getting on those training plans now, especially if you've got an auditor who doesn't understand what he's looking at with IT or this control system side, but he understands how to audit training.